Light Fingers by Francis Durbridge. Paul Temple, a popular novelist and famous private detective, placed a red carnation in the buttonhole of his dinner jacket, flicked a fleck of dust from his trousers, and carefully adjusted his evening dress bow. It was New Year's Eve, and both the novelist and Mrs. Temple, known affectionately as Steve, had been invited to a dinner party. The party was to be held at Nicholas Hall, a delightful old manor house on the Hog's Back just outside Guildford. The hall belonged to a friend of Paul Temple's called Sir Stephen Peters. Every year Sir Stephen gave a New Year's Eve party, and both Paul and Steve were invited. It was just after 6 o'clock when Steve climbed into the driving seat of her husband's new sports car and turned the bonnet of the car southwards. "Now drive carefully, Steve," warned Temple. "Remember, the roads are very treacherous at this time of year." Steve smiled, for in spite of the fact that she was a careful driver, they never started out a journey without Temple administering a friendly warning. As the car glided away from the curb and made for the open country, Steve glanced down at the illuminated clock on the dashboard. "How long should it take us to reach Guildford, Paul?" There was a twinkle in Temple's eye as he said, "We may never reach there if you don't keep your eyes on the road." "If there are any more complaints about my driving, Mr. Temple, I shall insist that you get out and walk." Temple glanced across at his wife and chuckled softly to himself. It was a funny thing about Steve, he reflected. Although she was a very keen driver, she never seemed completely relaxed. Even now she sat, clutching the wheel with both hands, an expression of grim determination on her features. When the car came to a standstill at the last set of traffic lights, just before they reached the open country, Steve did manage to relax slightly and remove her hands from the steering wheel. The lights changed from amber to green, and the car moved forward. Temple glanced into the driving mirror and suddenly sat bolt upright. "By Timothy," he said, "this fellow behind us seems to be in a hurry." Steve turned her head and noticed a black saloon car bearing down on them. "You'll have to pull into the side, Steve," exclaimed Temple, "or he'll force you into the hedge." As Temple spoke, the overtaking car lurched forward, and Steve instinctively reached for the handbrake. There was a scraping of metal and a sudden bump as the back mudguard of the saloon caught the wing of Temple's car. Steve skillfully manoeuvred the car into the side, and as it came to a standstill, switched on the headlights. In the distance, they could see the saloon roaring its way down the country road. In a little while it was completely out of sight. Steve sat for a moment, trying to regain her breath. She was obviously a little frightened. Temple said very quietly, "That was excellent driving, my dear. If you'd lost your head, we should have been involved in a very nasty accident." "Did you notice the driver of the car?" Temple shook his head. He was heavily muffled, and he wore his hat right down over his eyes. "I doubt very much whether I should recognize him again." He got out of the car and surveyed the damage. The wing was scratched, and there was a dent near the offside lamp. "You've had a nasty shock, Steve. You'd better let me drive for the rest of the journey." As he climbed into the driving seat, Temple heard the sudden whir of a motor horn and the sound of an approaching car. Steve was already staring out of the window, unable to suppress her excitement. "Here's a police car, Paul," she shouted. "I believe they're chasing the man who bumped into us." The police car came to a sudden halt, and Temple recognized his old friend, Chief Inspector Brooks. Temple lowered the window. "What's happened, Inspector?" The inspector was a thick-set man with a jovial face and a weather-beaten countenance. He looked more like a farmer than a police inspector, and because of this his enemies frequently underrated him. Brooks was in fact a shrewd North countryman with an intimate knowledge of the London underworld. "There's been a robbery at Malfrey's the jewellers in New Bond Street. Light Fingers layman made a smash and grab. He got away with a diamond necklace worth £30,000. Temple said. "A black saloon crashed into us. It was driven by a man in a dark overcoat and a muffler over his face." "Was that the notorious layman?" The inspector nodded. Yes, that was Lightfingers, all right. Which way did he go, Temple? He went straight down the road ahead, volunteered Steve. The number of the car was UMX 829. Oh, we know the number of the car, Mrs. Temple, said Brooks, but if he once makes a getaway, 10 to 1, he'll abandon the car or change the number plates. As the inspector spoke, the police car shot forward, and before Temple had even time to wave goodbye, it was nearly out of sight. Have you heard of Lightfingers Layman? Asked Steve. Temple changed gear, and the sports car once again moved forward into the centre of the road. I first heard of him 2 or 3 years ago when he broke into the North Midfield Bank at Exeter. Lightfingers is what they call a lone operator. He works entirely on his own. Would you recognise him if you saw him? Very much doubt it, said Temple. I've only seen photographs of him. If I remember rightly, he has a rather nasty scar across the back of his left hand. The car gathered speed, and Paul Temple found himself thinking of Lightfingers Layman. Although he had never actually encountered Lightfingers, the novelist knew only too well from the confidential reports he'd seen on the Exeter case at Scotland Yard that he was a most dangerous criminal. After they had been driving for about a quarter of an hour, Steve suddenly drew Temple's attention to the police car. It was about 100 yards ahead of them, parked by the side of the road under a huge tree. Temple took his foot off the accelerator. "What's happened, Inspector?" he called. There was a look of both annoyance and bitter disappointment on the inspector's face. He nodded towards the uniformed sergeant who was busy working the radio transmitter. "We've got a cordon round this entire district, but it looks as if Lightfingers has given us the slip, Temple." "We'll keep our eyes open, Inspector. If we see anything suspicious, I'll phone Sergeant O'Hara at Guildford." 10 minutes later, Temple did see something suspicious, and he was so surprised that he took his eyes off the road and grabbed Steve by the arm. "Look where you're going, Paul!" ejaculated Steve. Temple applied the brakes, and the car came to a standstill. He switched on the headlights. "Do you see what I see, Steve?" Steve turned her head, and then suddenly she realized what her husband was staring at. In a little clearing, about 10 or 20 yards down from the main road, stood the black saloon car. It had obviously been forced off the road, or deliberately driven off, for the front wheels rested in a narrow ditch and the radiator was embedded in the bank. While they were watching the car, a man came running up the bank and onto the road. He was a nervous, shriveled-up little man with a clean-shaven face and long dark hair. He carried his overcoat over his left arm. The man hesitated for a moment, shielding his eyes from the glare of the headlights. Paul Temple took careful stock of the stranger before dimming the lights. The man certainly didn't look like the notorious Lightfingers, although there was a nasty cut across the lower part of his face which added a sinister touch to his appearance. He explained that his name was Professor Thompson, and that he was on his way to Guildford. "I was driving along in my car when suddenly this car," he pointed to the black saloon, "overtook me and crashed into the ditch. I hurried down the bank to see if I could be of any assistance, but to my astonishment—" "The driver of the other vehicle knocked you out and stole your car," said Temple. The little man nodded. He looked both surprised and relieved. "But that's exactly what happened," he stammered. "How on earth did you know?" Temple told the professor about the robbery and about Lightfingers Layman, added, "You'd better let us drive you into Guildford, Professor." The professor was highly delighted at the suggestion and lost no time climbing into Temple's car. "I should be extremely grateful if you would drive me to Guildford," he said. "I have a most important appointment at 8 o'clock. The little man seemed far more concerned about keeping his appointment than about the arrest of Lightfingers and the recovery of the stolen car. "What sort of car were you driving?" asked Temple. "It's a brand new Austin, this year's model. It's dark maroon, and the registration number is EKL 974. "Well, that shouldn't be difficult to find," said Temple. "I'll contact the police as soon as we come up to the next phone box." "Oh dear," said the professor. "This is most disturbing. I do hope I shan't be late for my appointment." Paul Temple smiled, moved the gear into position, and released the clutch. "Your appointment must be a very important one, Professor." The professor nodded. "I'm an antique dealer and a collector of rare coins," he explained. "Earlier this evening a lady telephoned me from Guildford with the exciting news that she had discovered a Queen Elizabeth Bank of England note and that she was prepared to consider a reasonable offer for it." "Is the note valuable?" asked Steve. "Valuable?" The professor was obviously thunderstruck by such a question. "It's unique," he exclaimed. "All my life I've been on the lookout for such a treasure." Temple said, "I suppose you're anxious to contact the lady before any of the other collectors get to hear of the discovery." The professor looked very worried. "That's exactly what I'm afraid of," he said. "I simply must get to Guildford before any of the Bond Street collectors." "Well, we'll do the best we can, Professor," said Temple, "but I'm afraid you'll have to wait while I telephone the police." The nearest telephone was at the crossroads a mile or so down the road. Temple stopped the car and, after pocketing the ignition key, crossed the grass plot to the telephone box. "I want to speak to Sergeant O'Hara," said Temple, when the telephone operator put him through to police headquarters. Sergeant O'Hara was delighted to hear from Paul Temple, for he had known Temple in the old days when the novelist had investigated the Front Page Men affair. "Compliments of the season," bellowed the little Irishman. "But what in the wide world brings you down to this part of the country now?" Temple spoke very quietly, and as he spoke he stared out of the telephone box at the professor and Steve, who were engaged in an animated conversation. Temple said, "Listen, Sergeant. Steve and I are on our way to Nicholas Hall, and we want you to send a police car out to meet us. We should reach the outskirts of Guildford in about a quarter of an hour." Although O'Hara was bewildered, he sensed the tone of urgency in Temple's voice. "Is anything the matter?" he said quietly. Paul Temple said, "Yes, I've got the man you're looking for. I picked him up 5 minutes ago." The sergeant gasped. He knew that Temple must be referring to Lightfinger's layman. "By the Lord Harry," he stammered, unable to believe his own ears. "Not Lightfinger's layman." "Lightfinger's layman," said Paul Temple quietly. And 10 minutes later, thanks to the astuteness of Paul Temple, the notorious Lightfingers was arrested. Later that night, or rather in the early hours of the new year, Paul Temple told Steve and his old friend Sir Stephen Peters why he had suspected the bogus professor. "As soon as I saw him carrying his overcoat over his left arm, I was suspicious," said Temple. "It was a very cold night, and yet obviously he was determined not to wear his coat. I realized, however, that the overcoat must be serving a particular purpose. It was, in fact, concealing the scar on the back of his left hand." "That was clue number 1, said Steve. "But what was the second clue, Paul?" "The second clue," explained Temple, "was when the professor said that his car had been stolen. He described the car as a brand new model, registration number EKL974. I knew that he was lying immediately he told me the registration number. A new car would never be registered as EKL. These letters belong to the 1938 or 39 period." "And the third clue?" asked Sir Stephen. "The third clue was the most important of them all," said Temple. "It was when the professor pretended to be a collector of rare coins. He said that he was going to Guildford in order to buy a very valuable Queen Elizabeth Bank of England note." "Well?" said Steve, obviously puzzled. Paul Temple smiled. "There is no such thing as a Queen Elizabeth Bank of England note," he said quietly. "Such notes didn't exist in the time of Queen Elizabeth. The first Bank of England note was issued in 1694.
If you like that story, consider supporting me as a patron. That way you help me make more stories for you and get access to a patrons-only library of stories. Lots more hours for you to listen to.
That was Lightfingers. I should have done it in an accent by Francis Durbridge rather than the accents I did, the pastiche northern detective and the Irish sergeant. Cheap stage accents, all of them. Now, Let me tell you a little wee bit about Francis Durbridge himself. Now, okay, so it was a short one, but I did a long one last week. So it all balances out, it swings and roundabouts. So, hope you'll be content. Paul Temple, the novelist and amateur detective, this is what I'm like all the time, I just cut those bits out, became one of the most popular characters on BBC Radio during the years of the Second World War, and was later successfully transferred into films and television. A clean-cut, tough and sinewy man, his satisfaction comes from ferreting out murky truth wherever it lies at the bottom of the social burrow, and giving it a figurative one from the shoulder between its shifty eyes. According to his creator, Francis Durbridge, Radio Times added to this pen picture of Temple in 1960 when introducing a new serial by claiming that the Emperor of the private eyes, those brave and upright incorruptibles whom the public love because they are larger than life, uncomplicated in their psyches and bound to prevail over cunning and guile, is Mr. Paul Temple, with his soigné little mate, Steve, working right alongside. That was an interesting feature, wasn't it, that his wife has a man's name. I can see a remake coming on, to be honest. I think there's going to be a 2025 remake of this, brought bang up to date. So, the radio series, in fact, flourished for 30 years, from 1938 to 1968, opening with Hugh Morton and Marjorie Westbury, the latter of whom remained with the programme until its finale. Come on, Tony. Despite several new Paul Temples, there were a bunch of Paul Temples during those years: Carl Bernard, Barry Morse, Howard Marion Crawford, Kim Peacock, and lastly, Peter Coke, not Peter Cook, Peter Coke. And then there was a film calling Paul Temple, made in 1948 with John Bentley, the star of many low-budget post-war British action movies in the lead role. Dinah Sheridan was Steve in this picture, as well as in 2 sequels. A lady. Paul Temple's Triumph, 1950, and Paul Temple Returns, 1952. She also repeated the role when she and Bentley starred in the 12-episode BBC TV series Paul Temple, also scripted by Durbridge, which was screened in 1968. Well, I don't remember any of that, really. I just can't. I've got this book called The Television Detectives Omnibus, which I dipped into last week, and for some reason it was still there, so I thought, let's have a leaf through. I was going to do a Van der Valk story. It was only a page and a half. I thought, oh my goodness, there'll be complaints about that. So even though this is quite short, it's not as short as that one. So I actually had some notes about Paul Durbridge as well. Born 1912 in Hull, England. Hull. It was a prominent, that's a pastiche as well, a parody. I don't mean to upset anybody, English crime writer and playwright, and Paul Temple, and he wrote radio plays. So he attended the local grammar school and later studied at the University of Leeds, where he developed an interest in writing and drama. Sounds a bit like me, apart from I wasn't born in Hull. And I did attend the local grammar school, and I later studied, but not at the University of Leeds, at the University of Wales. So Durbridge began his career as a journalist and scriptwriter for radio. His early work involved writing short stories and scripts. And then, of course, he did several novels. Most famous were The Man Who Died, 1941, The House on the Hill, 1942, The Twelfth Night, 1949, The Last Train, 1940, and then, of course, his success was through the radio plays. This is Paul Temple, who, although he says he's the guy who runs straight from the shoulder between the shifty eyes of the lowlife, he's he lives near Guildford. He can't be that rough, can he? Anyway, and these continue to be popular right through the 1970s, and they kind of died away now. So intricate plots, clever twists, and a focus on psychological elements. Well, I'm not sure we got any psychological elements, but engaging characters. I think the characters were, they were brief pen portraits. There's a guy called Dwight Swain who was an American pulp writer, and he wrote a book called The Techniques of the Selling Writer, and it's a fantastic book. If you've got any aspirations to be a popular writer, you should read that. And he talked about the skill of being able to characterize people in 2 lines, in a way that was memorable. So, I mean, in this case, Lightfingers, he has the name Lightfingers, doesn't he? And he has the scar. And then when he describes as a thin man, I can't remember what he said, but he has his overcoat over his arm. And then I mean, the North Country detective and the Irish sergeant are complete caricatures, as is Sir Peter, what's his name, who has the hall in Surrey. But we're not. This isn't Madame Bovary, is it? It's about entertaining people, and I thought it was entertaining, and it was short. So let's have it. And I'm not going to go on too long. You'll be pleased to know, but just to say something about the shape of the story. So we have the setup to go into this party, then we have the inciting incident, which is then bumped by the bad guy, and then we have a bit of information, which isn't an information dump. It's presented as a conversation, so you don't think like even some very well considered novelists will stop you for a minute and bend your ear and give you a page of backstory and like, oh right, okay. And most of the time we accept that, but creative writing classes say don't do that. You've got to introduce backstory kind of more organically, and I think this is what he does. We get the crack, as we say, from the North Country inspector, and then that sets us up for seeing the car. It's all very plausible, isn't it? It's run off the road. We've seen how hairily, scarily he's driving, so it's completely plausible. There wasn't any part of that, I don't think, that we thought, apart from, I think, the idea that the professor, this notorious criminal, yeah, I get that he would accept a lift from this apparently straight looking, because they're not cops. They don't look like cops. They're not cops. There's Steve, the lady, and the wife, and his Steve's husband, Paul Temple, and not necessarily. So I believe, yeah, he would get in. I get the thing about him hiding his hand. And the only thing is, would he not be suspicious? They say he's going to ring the police. So I would have liked to know more about what was going through Paul Temple's mind. But of course, that would have made it a much more complicated story, because then we would have had to have some way of seeing into Temple's thinking. And how would we have done that? He would have had to have been seen to observe, to act furtively, to do something suspicious, because we couldn't have had any dialogue or information. It would have to be completely visual. But we don't get that, because it would have made the story longer and more complicated. And so we have to be kind of content with it's not unbelievable, but it stretches belief a little bit that this notorious criminal who's got away all this time suddenly goes, yeah, okay, I'll just sit in the car while you ring the police, and yeah, drive me too. I mean, yeah, I can believe it, but I think he'd be a bit more savvy than that, wouldn't he? Anyway, and then so that is the plot, and then we have the denouement, the classic golden age of detection, which the readers stroke listeners stroke watchers on the TV are looking out for. What happens always in this genre at this time, and even perhaps now with the crime story, is that the detective explains to us dense people what it is that twigged him, that he got it. So do you know the origin of twig is actually Irish? Did you know that? The Oxford Dictionary doesn't admit that, but it is. And so in classical Irish you would say an doig tú, an doig tú. Do you understand? You say a digging to now, but in classic Irish, it's an doig tú. So do you twig? There we go. Yeah, they won't accept. I keep writing to them various etymologies of words, and they're anti-Celtic. The Oxford English Dictionary. They won't accept. Or they're anti-me. One of the two. And maybe other reasons. I don't know. So anyway, getting back to my point. So he gives the denouement, and and it is like Sherlock, isn't it? So Sherlock knows stuff. He just knows stuff. Sherlock knows about ash. He knows about boots. He knows about everything. Paul Temple also knows about things. He knows about banknotes. The Queen Elizabeth, and of course the interesting thing, of course, when this came out, Queen Elizabeth II hadn't happened and wasn't meant to happen, because she only, her dad, depends when it came out, 39, 40, I'm not sure, it was around about that time. So had George VI ascended to the throne. Anyway, Queen Elizabeth wasn't a thing, the second. There was only Queen Elizabeth III, so they didn't need to explain it. I think any later they would have to. The first Queen Elizabeth, they would have probably said. Do we say now the third King Charles? I don't know. Anyway, so that was clue number 3, and then there was his absolute knowledge of car registration numbers. He's a bit of a nerd. I used to be in a pub quiz team, and I took it not very seriously. It was just a chance to go around, eat chips, and drink beer, and answer a few questions if I happened to know them. But some people would learn things. They would sit and learn American football teams. That was a very common one. A lot of US stuff. I don't know why. States of America. Somebody. I remember one question. Somebody says, "What's the state capital of Georgia?" And I said, "Tbilisi, obviously." And I went, "No, it's Atlanta." I went, "No, it depends which Georgia you mean." Anyway, so it's just anyway. So, but I got the chips anyway, so that was all right. But yes, we knows that, and he just knows stuff. So the point is, we have the denouement, and the detective is shown as far more intelligent than we are, and job's a good one, as they say. So that's it, done. Nice, brief, quick, typical detective story, not unpleasing at all. I love that, like, 1940s vibe of a lost world, and we read a lot of stories for vibes, as I've said elsewhere. They may say we read them for character or plot, but we also read stories for vibes. And I think particularly with detective stories, particularly with television detective stories that go on for hours and hours and hours and hours, they usually make them like 2 hours. And they're so complex, and you've lost track. I tell you which was an example of this. J.K. Rowling, as you may know, wrote a series of detective stories under the pseudonym Robert Galbraith, and they recently televised one. I hope it wasn't on the BBC. I've got secret reasons for saying that. It was, and there was Cormoran Strike in it, and I can't remember the name of the actor, but he's really good. The actors were really good. They were lovely characters. I really warmed to them. And it was set in kind of North London and Highgate Cemetery, and amongst gothy people and arty people. And so I just loved the vibe. I hadn't got a clue what was going on. But I kept watching it. I had no idea. I knew what the crime was, but that was about it. And then I went into my local bookshop, and there it was on offer, television tie-in, and it looked nice, but it was massive, and I thought it's going to take me. And my final point is, if you're considering adapting, this is my advice to you, a story for a film script or TV, don't do a novel, particularly not a long novel. There's too much in them. Do a short story. Short stories work really well. There you have it. Okay, I hope you're all well. I'll be back soon, next week, in fact. Yeah. Stay well. Don't get too cold. It's been very cold this winter, so don't get too cold.